Hello again. I'll tell you in a bit why I'm standing outside a cement plant. In the last video on internationalising, we explored how location has a big impact onto the advantages that a firm has. Also, in the previous lecture chunk, we also explored what is firm-specific advantage. How does a firm gain an advantage that overcomes the liability of foreigners when it expands its business into a new country? And we looked at how different forces in different industries resulted in different approaches. Where there were strong forces for global integration, you adopted a more standard approach. Gained advantage by extending your activity system to encompass those overseas operations, or transferred those unique resources to gain advantage. Where there were strong forces for local responsiveness, tailoring to the local market, you tailored your approach to local conditions. However, looking at an industry level doesn't capture the complexity you face when going international. Different functions in a business will also have forces for integration and forces for local responsiveness. Research, for example, may be consistent across all nations, while sales, because it interfaces directly with the local cultural, local business approaches, will need to be tailored far more to local conditions. The same can be said for the task being carried out. Distribution, fitting in with local clients, perhaps in the retail sector, different countries may have different approaches. Whilst in terms of product policy, in terms of advertising, there may be more consistency across national boundaries. And then we could also look at competencies and resources the firm has. Certainly those market-based competencies that Farah and her colleagues describe will be far more embedded into the approaches taken in a country. While functionally based competencies, the core expertise in a particular sector may well be more global in the approach you can take with them. So, complexity around how those forces of global integration and of local responsiveness play out, even in industries where in aggregate there is a strong push for more standardization. This complexity means whatever the organization we're in, they do need to look at how they change their approach to advantage in moving across national borders. Now, in a previous video, we explored how blue ocean might be used to create new market space in moving into a new nation. But for a multinational, the challenge will be doing that consistently. And as a result, you may like to see the blue ocean process more as a consistent and repeatable routine, and therefore a dynamic capability. So dynamic capabilities would appear to be something that all successful multinationals need to deploy. Now remember, those dynamic capabilities are the organization's ability, that consistent ability that is made up of routines and mechanisms to develop and deploy the firm's resources and competencies. So in an international context, the routines that allow it to exploit the firm's existing competencies and resources to enhance them wherever they're being used, and also to take advantage of location to renew those resources across whatever borders the firm operates. So these three steps of exploiting, enhancing and renewing are key to the success of a multinational. If we look at each of these a bit more deeply in turn, when we're looking at exploiting, We're trying to identify which resources we have as an organisation that can be exploited internationally. Some of those resources, competencies we have, will be too connected to the local circumstances for them to successfully be translated and take root in another location. So we need to be careful about identifying the right resources and competencies which we try to transfer and exploit in a new target country. Now, Lazard, Lucia and Vives offer a simple test to step through to identify those resources that they call the RAT test. Now, this is a simple reminder of things you're checking. So you're first looking at those competencies and resources you have that create value in your home nation. Perhaps you're in Mexico. So which of those are relevant that can be used to create value elsewhere? So perhaps a particular competency is relevant for a move into the UK market, but would not be relevant to a move into Australia. But just being relevant is not enough. That competency resource has to be what's called appropriable in that target country, so that if you move it to that new location, you as an organisation gain the value rated. That value is not being captured by another party, perhaps due to local circumstances in distribution channels or local regulations. And then finally, you need to look at physically, can you transfer it? Can it be effectively moved and used in the target nation? Using that test identifies the resources and competencies that you should be focusing on to transfer. Once you've transferred those existing competencies to a new target country, the focus then shifts to how you can enhance them, both in your home nation and in that new country. And where they are enhanced, look to bring them back into the portfolio of competencies that the organisation has. So you're looking to build up this virtuous circle. So the existing competencies and resources, you're looking to exploit them into other markets and then bring new competencies and resource back into the operations of the whole multinational. However, not all the competencies and resources that you discover and develop in new geographies will enhance the portfolio. And for identifying which of those competencies can be used to enhance the portfolio, Lazard and colleagues offer the CAT test. Again, very simple, but checking that those discovered resources are complementary to the resources that you already have. They're not going to work against that portfolio. And then again, are they appropriable in, say, the home nation? And are those resources and competencies transferable? But your focus doesn't stop there in terms of the exploiting of competencies and resources and then their enhancement and adoption into the host organisation. As a business, you're also looking to tap into that impact of location, as we talked about in the last video, that double diamond. So formally encouraging the renewal of those competencies in situ. Let's have a quick look at an example of this and why I'm outside a cement company. Now, Cemex is a global leading cement and concrete company with long history of origins in Mexico. And in the 1970s and 80s, it was starting its journey towards being an international organisation. Now, the way it had developed in Mexico and dealing with local conditions there, absence of factors and conditions, the local institutional environment, meant that it had developed deep operational expertise, not just in manufacturing, but also in delivery and in communication and the integration of its Mexican business. Now, the first international move it made was to acquire 2 cement factories in Spain. And moving into that Spanish market, it identified its operational effectiveness as something it could exploit to generate additional value in those acquired firms. So exploiting that competencies and resources it had developed in Mexico into the Spanish operation. But Cemex didn't stop there. In that acquisition of those Spanish businesses, it acquired and developed other competencies and resources. It developed the capabilities to do deal financing and tapping into capital markets in the European Union. It developed further its post-merger integration capability, its PMI capability. And it also discovered a novel way of fueling its furnaces in one of the acquired operation. They were using petroleum coke, pet coke, a waste product from oil refining that was very cheap. Cemex then brought those competencies back into its resource portfolio. It rolled out the use of pet coke across a large number of its plants in Mexico, and also started to apply the PMI capability onto its existing business to further enhance its operational effectiveness. However, it hadn't been standing still in its domestic operation. Given the high proportion of cement sold for self-build and to small builders in Mexico compared to elsewhere in the world, Cemex had developed its concept of Costurama, a retail network, and also branding, which is applying to its bags. It had also invested in developing routing capabilities using satellite tracking, and its culture of acting as an integrated operation was developing. That an enlarged set of competencies and resources was then used extensively in the next tranche of overseas moves it made into the southern US and into Latin and Southern America. And through that move, it brought in more competencies, including a trading and pooling approach that it was using across the Gulf of Mexico, adding more competencies into its resource portfolio and enhancing its existing competencies. For example, that PMI, that post-merger integration competency. So in the 2000s, when it moved to even larger acquisitions, including the UK-based group RMC, a concrete manufacturer, it was able to exploit the full range of those competencies. So Cemex has put in place this virtuous circle of exploiting, enhancing, and renewing its competencies. Now, underpinning that, there has to be a systematic search for opportunities to exploit and enhance resources. And this is where dynamic capabilities come in. For it's those consistent, repeatable, formal mechanisms that successful multinationals put in place that enables that systematic process to happen. Now remember, when we talked about dynamic capabilities, there were 3 types. There were learning or sensing dynamic capabilities, there were managing or seizing dynamic capabilities, and there were transforming dynamic capabilities. And multinationals have to think about dynamic capability across all these 3 areas. In terms of managing dynamic capabilities, organisations then need to think about their organisational design. Now traditionally, where there have been strong forces for global integration, a very centralised, headquarter-centric approach has been taken to how to structure a multinational, with the headquarters, the home business, putting in place strong central control. There's a lot of formalisation and standardisation of approach, so there's little local tailoring, and very little local autonomy is provided to those subsidiaries. They just follow the standard approach that's required. In contrast, traditionally, where there has been strong forces for local tailoring, a more decentralised approach has been taken, with control being far more informal and less standardised. Control often rests just upon simple financial controls. But as we've seen, that simple view of multinationals misses the complexity. So organisations like CEMEX tend to have more of a network, an integrated network approach to managing their operations, with the headquarters not always dominant in all areas. So the distribution of resources and capabilities and specialism leads to leadership being taken in specific areas, with subsidiaries allowed a degree of autonomy with which to experiment and look to tailor activities to their local area, but then a requirement to share new knowledge, expertise and competencies back into the group as a whole. To do that, you'll see there's a focus onto the flows of knowledge amongst the different units in the organisation. A lot of emphasis on the processes and behaviours that allow that knowledge to flow across the organisation. For you to think about it, that is a significant challenge. Knowledge is often tacit and has a stickiness, and that acts as a barrier to transfer. And yet, you could argue that that transfer of knowledge across boundaries is why the multinational exists in the first place. So, multinationals look to put in place mechanisms that overcome this challenge. You often see things like dedicated cross-functional and country teams being brought together to deal with particular issues. You will certainly see the top management team being very active and hands-on in their support and promotion of sharing of knowledge and expertise across the business. You'll see additional communication channels being opened up, internal social media networks being adopted across the whole organisation, a focus onto learning within the culture of the organisation, that being linked to tangible measures, and reward and credit being given to the sharing and to the adoption of new ideas and of new knowledge. You'll be seeing HR programs like training and staff transfers, and also frequent expert forums, gatherings, all to reduce barriers and build personal connections across the business. So, sets of formal routines and mechanisms that not just happen once, but happen regularly and systematically across the business to ensure the flow of knowledge and the exploitation, enhancement and renewal of the firm's portfolio of resources and competencies. So, to conclude, across this study unit on internationalising and strategy, well, a multinational corporation's success depends on its ability to transfer firm-specific advantages across national borders, and so overcome that challenge of the liability of foreignness. However, you have to recognise that value is generated from that interplay between firm-specific and country-specific advantages. You need to look to how you create a virtuous circle of resource enhancement, how they are developed, transferred, developed further, transferred, both between the headquarter and its subsidiaries, and directly between subsidiaries. The design of the multinational needs to reflect the balance between those forces for global integration and the local drivers that need tailoring. Going back right across the complexity of industry, function, task and resources is a challenge and requires the organisation to constantly learn from across its business and to exploit that learning on a worldwide basis. Doing that requires a systematic approach to formal routines and to those mechanisms, so it needs dynamic capabilities. Thank you for listening.